Good morning, folks, and welcome to Race Matters. I am Eddie Carson, and I'm excited about our guest today. I would like for you to meet Sylvia Swayne. Sylvia, say hello to everyone.
Hi, everybody. Hey, y'all.
Sylvia is coming to us from Birmingham, Alabama, and Sylvia has a phenomenal story. She is really engaged in some real community activist work in which she's looking to essentially be a voice for a lot of people, particularly at home in her district where she is running for office. Sylvia, if you don't mind, just for a second, will you just introduce yourself and share a little bit for our guests who are watching?
Absolutely. Thank you. Yeah, my name is Sylvia Swayne. I am a 26-year-old running for state office in Alabama. There's a special election on Tuesday, September 26th, um, for the Alabama State House of Representatives in District 55. I also happen to be the first transgender woman to run for state office in Alabama. And so it's a historic campaign in that sense, but ultimately the reason I'm running is because there has been so much political division and there has been so much finger pointing. We've made the LGBT community out to be this boogeyman and creating bills and laws that affect that group, all while the rest of Alabama stays behind. We don't do things like expanding Medicaid. We don't invest in public education. We don't invest in public transportation. We do all these things that hold us all back, but then point to a certain group as the problem. And I'm running to show folks, one, that young people can can have an elected official who resonates with them and activate them, but also show people that at the end of the day, trans people are people just like anybody else. And we don't have to be this distraction from the big issues, the things that affect all of us.
Sylvia, I appreciate that, and really hearing that for the fact that your platform essentially centered on this idea that you can serve a lot of different constituents and populations and folks, regardless of their identity, their race, their background, where they come from, and all of those narratives are super important. I have a question for you. And, me being a Black man who grew up in Montgomery, Alabama, I'm fully aware of the politics, particularly that the racial binary that sometimes exists as we start to frame some of the positions that we want. Unfortunately, here in the 21st century, especially in the year 2023, we're quite tribal. Everyone runs to their camps, and there's no coalescing around the ideas that you just pointed out. So, I'm curious, and I love to hear this from you. As a white woman living in a predominantly Black district, how has your own sense of white privilege been informed?
This district is incredibly gerrymandered, and going from neighborhood meetings on the east side where I live um, is a much different experience than going to neighborhood meetings on the west side. The east side of the district is predominantly white. It is wealthier. There's more money, um, and so the experience is in very stark contrast to the west side of the district, where there are houses that are run down. There's more trash. There's a lack of infrastructure, um, and it really does show you, as someone who's white running for office and visiting all folks, how different experiences can be in Alabama. I also can see some similarities, no matter where you are in the district, crime and public safety is a concern. Birmingham has very high crime rates. And so even perspectives on crime and how to address public safety, this whole experience of campaigning has illuminated my own privilege of in the east side there is still crime, but it is easier to turn your head away from it. And so and that's not 100% true in some neighborhoods. Like there is very much like crime in your face, even in certain neighborhoods in the east side of the district. But you can go home and not think about it as much. Um, there are other concerns that are not as significant in the day to day on the east side versus the west side. So I would just say that sort of dichotomy in the district is so racialized. We had desegregation, but we didn't have integration. And that's apparent from being in this campaign and how different my own experiences have been as a white person.
No, and I love the way you said that too, right? We have desegregation, but no real sense of integration where folks are coming together and everything too. Have you found that there's been some finger pointing when it comes to matters of crime? We know there are populations of folks, and I'm just going to say this because, this is my show and I can say whatever I want to say, but it's interesting when it comes to crime. I always hear, particularly Republicans, point the fingers at the fact that crime exists because of Democrats. Crime exists, right? Here we go, because of Black people. And we know that's not the case whatsoever. Do you hear that?
I don't hear it put so overtly, but I mean, that is the heavy implication, right? We had in the last legislative session in Alabama a bill that fortunately, was amended to be a little bit less racially pointed. The final language they used was criminal enterprise, but originally it was gang activity, and they were talking about gang signs and how people dress, and the Democratic representatives in the House did do a great job of explaining, like, how can you differentiate, how can a law enforcement officer differentiate a gang sign from like a fraternity or sorority, a handshake or sign. And but they made this bill that would increase the severity of penalties if someone is found to be part of a criminal enterprise. And originally they used the word gang activity. And it was a very racially pointed bill, and still is for that matter, but they did make the language a little bit less overt. But you're right. I think whenever I see a bill introduced that makes something else a felony, I do think about the racial component, right? There's so many reasons why those bills get introduced and passed. Once you're convicted of a felony, your voting rights are taken away. We still have legalized slavery in our prison system. These are all ways in which we target Black folks with our criminal justice system. And I do see that. I see in this district finger pointing at the homeless population, people who are unhoused. There are lots of issues that there's finger pointing, and of course it's racialized.
That racial dichotomy is interesting because we know matters of race are ubiquitous. They frame everything, especially when we're talking about certain communities and everything. Mm-hmm. So, I'm curious. How will you, Sylvia Swayne, move folks across racial lines to engage as a community in your campaign to represent Black folks, brown folks, queer folks, working class, white Alabamians?
So I think about my time as a student organizer in Students for Fair Labor, which was the name of our local at the University of Alabama for United Students Against Sweatshops. And at USAS, United Students Against Sweatshops, I was a co-chair for the Collective Liberation Caucus. And the motto of collective liberation, the mantra is none of us are free until all of us are free. And what it takes is not comparing our struggle, but identifying that we all lose when we don't work together. The experience I have as a trans woman, if you compare it as a white trans woman, let me clarify, if you compare that to folks who are much poorer, who are Black, like there's absolutely privilege in my experience. However, the same forces that hold me back come from that same white supremacist patriarchy. And it takes all of us working together and recognizing our own part in that. Um, it's not the same struggle, but it is, the root is similar. And so I think that's a big part of how you reach across racial lines. I think you have to meet people where they are. You have to show up and focus on the issues and what we can do together. Because I'm not coming into any neighborhood meeting or any community event or any debate and saying, I have all the answers, you should vote for me and I'm going to fix it for you. You know, that's the white savior complex, and that's not at all what anyone can do, white or black. I would be one representative out of 105. And so it's not that I'm coming in and saying, I have all the solutions, I'm going to fix everything. What I am saying is I recognize that there's work already being done in the community, and that is not being reflected at the state level in the Capitol. And so we need to elect someone who wants to work alongside folks. That's ultimately what I think what it is at the end. It's working with people. I'm not a voice for anybody. I'm not just going to be this advocate, you know, like that's not my role as a representative. That's not my role as an ally to the Black community. It's my job to work alongside and amplify the work already being done. Because at the end of the day, it's about autonomy, it's about agency, it's about giving that back to all people. And that, of course, includes Black folks. So that's what I think you have to do. It's showing up, going to neighborhood meetings like I have been, and being present. I think a lot of times when folks get elected, they're like, okay, I did the work and now I'm just going to go do my thing and I'm never going to be accessible.
You know,
and
I'm glad you mentioned that, because, you know, it's one of the things I was curious about, and I was thinking, and I'm going to say this, and I can't, you know, I'm a Black man from Montgomery, Alabama, you know, growing up in Black communities and being around Black folks. And, you know, out of the mouth of Eddie Carson, I'm a truth teller. You watch this show, and that's what I do. As an academic, I can do that kind of stuff. And that's the fact that while I think things have gotten better within a Black community for a period of time, you know, for folks who don't know, one of my favorite people is this basketball player, and not because he's a basketball player. His name is Dwayne Wade. Sylvia, do you know Dwayne Wade?
yeah,
I sat there.
His daughter.
Yes, I sat there and listened to Dwayne and his wife get up and denounce the state of Florida and point fingers at Black folks too, because of how we think about inclusivity, particularly of trans folks. I believe he has a trans daughter, if I'm right. And I found it quite pointed for the fact that this brother's talking about how we coalesce and we love and we engage and we get to know folks the way we have to know them. What has been your experience in really congregating and meeting and talking to Black folks about Sylvia Swayne, the candidate, Sylvia Swayne, right? The woman, Sylvia Swayne, the trans woman.
I think it's not as, and maybe it's just the folks that I'm talking to who even know that there's an election, people who are more politically aware, because a lot of times people don't know what's going on. When I'm making calls to voters, they're like, I didn't even know there was an election next week. And so maybe the folks that I'm talking to might be more mindful of trans people to begin with. But I found the experience to be positive. I think that when I go to the west side of the district and I talk to folks, I feel like I'm, for the most part, accepted and embraced. I think that, of course, there's a hesitation. Who's this random 26-year-old white woman showing up and telling me to vote for her? I mean, that's something anyone's going to ask regardless of race, but there is a component there of what is she going to do for me? And it simply takes conversation. It simply takes listening and seeing where they align, not where they align, where we align, and figuring out the parallels and what we value. Because at the end of the day, it shouldn't be be about who I am, whether that is as a candidate, whether that is as a woman, and what it is as a trans woman. It's about what I value, and more importantly, what we value, and how we can get there. And people underestimate Black voters. People underestimate Black people. I don't believe that anyone is incapable of understanding. I don't think anyone is incapable of hearing a story and completely dismissing it. And what it takes is conversation. What it takes is proximity. What it takes is humanity. And that's the entire point of this campaign. It is creating a change, a shift in conversation, the narrative of this state. And I mean, I think that that's a message that rings true regardless of your skin color. And so I don't want to think of Black folks as a monolith. I don't want to think of Black folks as just, they're going to think that I am going to be this one thing and that there's no reason to listen. I would never assume that about any person. And I think maybe white folks are just uncomfortable talking about race. They're afraid to go there. And that doesn't mean that going there is always going to go well. It doesn't mean that I'm always going to say the right things, but you have to be willing to think past yourself. I think white folks try so hard not to be racist, they forget that the issue is combating racism. And it's going to take being uncomfortable, I guess. But I think more white people should be talking about race. I think more white people should be comfortable talking about race, and they should be more comfortable going into Black spaces and connecting. Because again, we desegregated, but we didn't integrate. And the only way to change that is to be active and to engage with folks. So that's a long-winded answer, but
no, my friend, that was perfect. And I love the fact that you're talking about, going into being in your community, right?
Mm-hmm.
Getting to know your neighbors, because that notion is thinking about your district, not as a district, but as a community of folks, regardless of what those differences may be. I was listening to you, and I just couldn't help but think about the fact that, Sylvia's like, I live here, I'm going to be here. Black folks were not a monolith. I think about particularly the National Democratic Party, right? You will not see a white presidential candidate in a Black neighborhood until it's election time. They'll swoop in, they'll hop into a Black church or come to a Black community gathering, and you'll never hear from them again at all, right? That won't happen. And that's just a reality that's there. So, I got to say this. I was thinking about this when you're speaking, but I have a pretty good idea of why I would vote for you if I were living in your district, right? Because I'm just going to go ahead and raise my hand and say that I'm moved by you. I followed your campaign. I'm in 100% support of the work that you're doing and the work that you're going to do for folks in District 55. And so here's a tough question here. You ready? For me as a Black man, right? And again, I'm just going to say, because I look through things at times through that racialized lens. It's just the reality here in the 21st century, especially in the state of Alabama. But as a Black man, why should I just want one reason, why should I vote for you when there are people who are running who look like me? And remember, I'm underrepresented. And you can give more than one reason, but in fairness, but I'm curious.
Well, the last part I think is almost a separate question about representation. So I'll focus on the why first, and I'll give you one reason for that, and then the second reason will be for representation.
Sounds good.
The first reason is I'm not asking for folks to vote for me because I'm transgender. I'm not asking for people to vote for me because I'm white or whatever. What I am asking people to vote for me, why I'm asking people to vote for me, is because I recognize as a trans woman that they are using the LGBT community as a distraction while disenfranchising Black people. This happened very overtly, directly, in my belief, at the special legislative session in July. They were supposed to redraw the congressional maps in Alabama because they did not comply with Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. And so the Supreme Court of the United States ordered the state of Alabama to redraw those maps. And they didn't draw a map that complied with Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. And in the limited time that they have during a special session, they didn't do their job that they were elected to do, and they introduced a bill to defund the Alabama archives because they had a 1-hour presentation in June about LGBT history. And that's kind of the issue, right? We're introducing these bills and these laws that waste our taxpayer dollars, that don't help anybody, you know? Banning transgender minors from accessing gender-affirming care does not help anyone get a better job, doesn't help them get to school. It doesn't give people health care, right? In fact, it's taking health care away from some others. And so I know in my heart of hearts that the issue itself is not just the attack on LGBT people. It is that we are being used as this boogeyman to let the state get away with further disenfranchising Black voters, to further disproportionately throw Black men in jail and to prison, charging them with harsher sentences. All these things are happening congruently at the same time. And it's been happening. When it's not, you know, transgender people, it's women's reproductive rights, or it's gay marriage, or it's immigration. It's all these different issues that come up, and that is at the expense of Black people. And so it will take people who are part of these distraction scapegoat groups being in office and having a seat at the table, because at that point, the folks who are legislating against those groups have to reconcile the fact that I'm a person. There is a difference in me showing up for a public hearing about an anti-LGBT bill for a 2-minute, you know, argument about who I am and my life story and why I'm a person and why you shouldn't support this bill. There's a difference from that and a transgender person every single day talking about all the issues, and they have to reconcile that relationship. And so you don't have to support trans people to support me as a candidate. You don't have to support trans people to vote for me, but you can vote for me knowing that I will never, never allow who I am be used as a weapon against Black people. That's my one reason. You don't have to support who I am, but I hope that in this process of campaigning and in these conversations, people know what I value. And I think that's why folks should vote for me. The second part is about representation, and that's a little bit a bigger picture thing. If representation matters, you know, there are 105 House representatives and 0 of them are transgender. If I were elected to be the first and only trans person in office, it would still be a disproportionate number compared to the number of trans people in Alabama, right? That would be less than 1% in the House, and it's about 1%. The number is actually very depending on the survey, but there's at least 1%, right? So less than 1% is still a lot fewer trans people in the House than are reflected in our population. So there's currently 0 representation for trans people in the House. So if representation is something that matters to you, then I think that should be considered. I do agree that Black folks are underrepresented, and I hope that continues to change. But I do think, you know, there's so much missing representation in the House currently. And so that's something to consider as well.
No, I love that. And, you know, in hearing you, I got to tell you, I'm super inspired here. The fact that I see you, I'm just going to say this, right? Coming out of the mouth of Eddie Carson is a burgeoning star for justice, for people who want a voice. And the fact that I can just, you know, people galvanizing. I've observed that. I've witnessed that. People who believe in Sylvia Swayne in the sense that you know, you mentioned your age, and that's something we haven't really said much about, right? There's always that suspicion about young folks, you know, because I can say I'm much older than you are, Sylvia, but we know that already. I know you can't tell, not There's no gray or nothing like that poking out or anything like that. But the age thing is interesting. You know, something that we haven't spoken about. At the age of 26, right? People curious or wondering, do you have enough experience, or have you done all the things that folks who are my age or even older than me who've been doing this for their entire lifetime of representing folks or running for office and everything too? How do you respond? What are your thoughts on this age question?
It does come up a lot. I think my response is to focus on what I value and what the message is. I think that is, in a way, for many, not all folks. I think it's a genuine concern for a lot of folks, but for many folks, it is used as a distraction, because experience, I think, is always an interesting subject when it comes to political candidates. I think that, yes, especially for higher offices like governor or president, federal Congress, you of course want them to know what they're doing and have the political know-how. At the same time, the people who are getting people in office, the voters, most voters are not career politicians. And so I think it's important that we have a number of people elected who reflect the people who elected them. And that includes young people. There are not enough young people in office. And I think that's a big reason that young people don't vote. They don't see people whose values resonate with them. And, I could go on and on about my experience. I could list my resume, but I have intentionally chosen not to do that, because that's not the point. The point is Alabama is losing right now. We're losing because we don't have enough people who have health insurance. We're losing because we don't have ways for people to get to work without being able to afford a car. We don't have, a real plan in place to address climate change. And all these things are happening in front of us. And I think a much more important conversation to have right now is, what are we going to do about it? I could tell you my resume. I could tell you that I have a history as an organizer. I've been attending demonstrations and protests since 2014. I've been doing that work. I'm familiar with parliamentary procedure because of things that I did in college. But that's not why I'm running. I don't. I hope through the process of this campaign, I hope people watched the forum and the debate and looked at my platform on my website and seen that I'm about that. Like, I'm about that life. I'm about the work that needs to be done. And so I've refrained from talking about my experience. Do I think comparatively to some candidates who have been in the political sphere, people who have already held office, people with decades of experience? Of course, I have less experience than that. If you have decades of experience while I have a few decades of life, like, of course, there's going to be a contrast there. But there's an entire decade of voters who are not represented right now. And we constantly leave those folks out of the conversation, but they have the right to vote. And what are we doing to activate young people? And so I would rather show people who I am. I would rather show people my experience and my perspective than telling them. And that's been my response. It's that concern is going to be there no matter what I say. So I'm just going to focus on what I'll do.
And speaking of what you're going to do, and I heard a little bit of that earlier and throughout our show and everything, but I just want to be clear. What are your top goals, would you say, for the district? Just so that I can see them, so that our listeners, folks in your district who may be listening, what are those goals?
I think the first thing is, and broadly speaking, is transparency. I think that this district has been let down for a long time by leaders. And I think it's important that their representative is accessible, that they only answer to the people of the district. And so that, I think, is really important, is being present, being engaged. In terms of policy and platform, there are several things that I want to push. As a Democratic candidate, it is no surprise that I want to expand Medicaid. But I think what sets me apart is how I want to expand Medicaid. I fully plan to work across the aisle. I am not interested in partisanship and division. I'm interested in getting the job done. And so speak the language of the people whose values may not be exactly the same. You can't just say healthcare is a right, we should expand Medicaid. That's not going to work in a Republican supermajority. But what could work is talking about all the jobs that we'll create, talking about the fact that we're already paying for Medicaid in other states with our federal taxes, our tax dollars. And we should be bringing that money back to the state to boost our own economy. People who are healthy are able to go to work. These are the talking points that you should be using behind the scenes and in front of the scenes to get the job done. And so that's the other campaign goal. It is meeting people where they are. And I've said this before, oftentimes people have the same why. Why do I want this? Why am I pursuing politics? Why am I trying to make this change? The why is usually so that they and their loved ones can have a happy, fulfilling life, that they can support themselves and their loved ones. The difference in that is the how. How do we get there? And so I'm much less concerned with the talking about the how with someone who has a different how. I'd rather focus on the why, and then we figure out the how together. And that is, it's so important to speak that language. Other platform and policy ideas, I'm a big fan of restorative justice. I think that our prison system is horrendous in Alabama. It is unethical, and it disproportionately targets Black people. We have to move past that. We have got to pass legislation that moves us in the right direction. I think a great step would be a second chance bill or law that would allow folks to have a second trial for, being sentenced to a harsh sentence for nonviolent crimes. We should reassess that. I think decriminalization of marijuana is an important step. I think that expanding medical licenses for medical marijuana is important. I support expungements. I'm thinking in terms of like what's attainable in Alabama. So a second chance bill, I think, would get passed before any expungements would happen. But restorative justice, finding ways to address the issue of crime at its root. Whether or not you support more or less law enforcement in our communities really can't be the conversation, because we have a law enforcement shortage. So what are we going to do about that? How are we going to address crime without just throwing more law enforcement officers at the problem? Because we can't. So let's not argue about that. Let's talk about the resources that we can provide communities that prevent crime in the first place. Investing in public education, not wasting our $2 billion education budget surplus on vouchers for private schools when we have failing public schools throughout the state that need that money. Public health, I spoke earlier about homelessness and how folks across the district are concerned about that. But I want to treat homelessness as the public health issue that it is, and not as a crime. Intravenous drug users, that's a public health crisis. That's not a crime. It shouldn't be viewed as a crime. There are resources that can help folks. I think that the right to vote is under attack. We spoke earlier about the special legislative session and how Black voters are targeted. That's not the only way that we target voters. We had a bill this past session that fortunately didn't pass, but Republicans are already on record saying they're going to bring it back this upcoming session, which is to create harsher penalties for absentee ballot voters. If you help someone with an absentee ballot and accept any sort of compensation for it, it would be considered a felony at that point. And it's just a really harsh penalty for helping someone vote, And so I support automatic voter registration, mail-in voting, making voting a holiday. Like there are so many ways that we should expand access to voting rather than restrict it further. But
Well,
we know.
no, I was going to say to that point. I mean, we know that's not going to happen, and particularly we've seen since the 2020 election, right? I mean, let's move boxes away. Let's make it harder, and particularly let's make it harder for Black people to
Yeah.
vote. And then again, right? We've seen the Supreme Court, we've seen legislative policies in states, particularly red states, chop into the Voting Rights Act of 1965. I mean, sometimes I look to see if it even still exists, and it's a skeleton of what Brother King once thought it was going to be. So, I interrupted you, my friend.
Oh, no, you're exactly right. I think the other thing to consider in how we get past that is young voters. Because if everybody in Alabama under 35 voted, everyone who qualified to vote voted under 35, we would not be in a Republican supermajority. It would be a quote unquote purple state. And that's the issue. So what are we doing as the Democratic Party? What are we doing as political candidates and elected officials to bring young people into the fold? Because if we did that, we would weaken that stronghold that the Republican Party has and then address these issues. But our strategy is missing because we are leaving 18, 19, 20, up to 29-year-olds, 35-year-olds out of the conversation. We're not even trying to bring them in. Talking about my experience as a 26-year-old, and I could talk all day about it, but that's not going to change anything because where is the effort to bring in 26-year-olds, right? If that's the criticism, that's pushing people away. And again, that's what I'm saying is we all have something to contribute together. We can unify, and regardless of our race, regardless of our gender, regardless of our orientation, our age, what have you, there is something that we can all do to bring us all forward. None of us are free until all of us are free.
I love it. I love it. My friend, we're getting close to the end here of Race Matters. I'm Eddie Carson. I'm here with Sylvia Swayne, a candidate for state rep in District 55. We're excited to have her here. Sylvia, as we get to the end, I have one more question for you, and I'm curious about this. Can you tell us about how your campaign has been financed? That's always something people are curious about. How has it been financed, and how can we trust that you will serve the people with that money that you're getting?
Yes, sir. So I'm very proud to say that we have funded our entire campaign with individual contributions, that we have not received corporate PAC dollars or special interest dollars. And that's really unique in a political campaign. A lot of folks do accept that money because that's where the big dollars come in. And I invite every voter, if you want to be an informed voter, part of being an informed voter is looking at their finance reports. Every candidate has to file them. And so look at where they're getting their money. And if they're getting money from a PAC, look at where that PAC is getting their money, because PACs have to file their finance reports. So you can see where the money trail is. And if they're giving thousands of dollars to a candidate, learn about that PAC. Who are they? What are their interests? What are they trying to do? Because when somebody gives you money, especially that much money, they're going to ask for something in return once elected. And that's why the overwhelming majority of our contributions have been under $100 from people across the state and even across the country. And I think at the end of the day, that's what really sets our campaign apart, is that we are powered by the people because we're for the people. And I am proud of that. I am proud that we have been able to do that, because if elected, we aren't going to be owing these organizations money. or not money, or owing these organizations legislation. I will be able to vote based on the conversations I'm having with voters and not based on the conversations I'm having with donors. And I really encourage folks to, as an informed voter, look in that in every single election. Where is the money coming from?
My friend Sylvia Swayne, I love it, and I'm just going to say this because I'm a biased person. I'll make sure you get that contribution as you continue to campaign and do the great work that you're doing. The fact that here's a Black man, unapologetic Black man. I love what you're doing, how you're representing folks in your district. And the thing that you're saying, and the love language that I heard from you most is the fact that while you're doing all of this stuff, you're concerned about the future of voting rights and the disenfranchisement of folks who are sometimes, not even sometimes, who are on the margins, who are worried about those things, right? Those are some of the things that are dear to my soul. And I'm sure a number of the other things that you're doing really resonates and connect with the folks in your district and everything too. So Sylvia, thank you for joining us here on Race Matters. For folks who are listening and viewing, you can see other episodes of Race Matters, the Race Matters podcast. You can visit my website, ProfessorCarson.com. Thank you. Thank you, Sylvia. I appreciate your time.
Thank you, Eddie. It's a pleasure.
Absolutely.